Well, good morning, everybody. I can't see you now with the lights in my eyes, but I trust you're all out there. Listen, first of all, thank you for being here. I've just been delighted with this conference so far. Maybe this talk will be a sag in the texture, we'll see. But I've loved this conference, and it's a dream come true for me. I think it was about 5 years ago I spoke to the LA Religious Ed Congress, and I was just getting going on this whole religion science dialogue. And I said, could all the science teachers here please stand? And they did. Could all the religion teachers please stand? And they did. And I said, you two groups need to talk to each other because there's a real problem with religion and science. And at that same meeting, I said, you know what I dream of is a big national conference where we talk about this issue with educators and with priests and with catechists and with scientists. So here you are. And I'm delighted. You know, as we get started, I just want to thank one institution and one person. First, the Templeton Foundation for the funds for this and so on. Terrific. The second person I want to thank is someone that goes unheralded way too often. A good friend of mine, the CEO of Word on Fire, Father Steve Grunow. Many of you know Father Steve, but he's someone that doesn't draw attention to himself. But if you think Word on Fire has an effective platform, don't thank me. I've been kind of dancing on the platform for the past many years, but Father Steve created the platform. He created the Word on Fire Institute. And I remember the moment. I was on my back porch in my home in Santa Barbara. He came out and he said, you know what we should do? We should have an institute for Word on Fire that has fellows, and they do research and writing, and they engage the culture. And I said, boy, that sounds complicated. And he said, no, we can do it. And so we did it. And that was Father Steve's initiative. Some of you probably heard Todd Warner, Todd speak yesterday, the editor of our marvelous Faith and Culture journal. Well, another Father Steve brainchild, he came out to me on the back porch again in Santa Barbara and said, you know, we should have a journal of faith and culture. I said, oh gosh, a journal, that's complicated. I don't know if we can pull that off. Well, we pulled it off. So I want to pay tribute to him, the CEO of Word on Fire, who's done... Okay, so listen, I'm going to do some philosophy with you today. So unlike our first two speakers, I wasn't formally trained in the sciences. I've got a sort of layman's interest in them, but I was trained in philosophy and theology. So I'm going to come at it from a somewhat different perspective. I'm not going to dwell on this first point too much because you all know this, that a major reason for disaffiliation among our young people is the supposed conflict between religion and science or faith and reason. Whenever I hear this, of course, my Catholic heart sinks. We are the great tradition of faith and reason. Whenever you hear this, that sound you hear in the background is Thomas Aquinas turning in his grave, because we stand for the unity of faith and reason. But look, I'll admit it, we've been bad at this. One reason, and if you follow me, you know this, we dumbed down the faith after the council, which was a thank you. And let's keep fighting against it. We dumbed it down, and it was a pastoral disaster. Look at the surveys. This is not just my private opinion. Look at the surveys. Time and time again, I never got my questions answered. Faith and science are at odds with each other. Religion is a lot of silly Bronze Age nonsense, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the culture is responsible, yes, to some degree, but we're responsible too, because we dumb down our own presentation of the faith. So get back in our schools and back with our very high intellectual tradition. So you know that. Here's what I'm going to do, is not address every possible issue here, but I'm going to focus it on the issue of scientism. And both of our speakers alluded to it yesterday. I'll define it as follows, because I think it's the fundamental problem. Scientism is the reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. So it's not saying one little thing against science. Science is great. The scientific method of careful observation, formation of hypothesis, testing of hypothesis through experimentation, the re-experimentation to confirm, drawing conclusions, et cetera, is a great method for analyzing events and objects in the physical universe. Terrific. That's science. Scientism is the reduction of all knowledge to that form of knowledge. I like when Karen showed the photo of the Pietà yesterday. The sciences could tell you through that method what the pietà is made of, what would happen if you put it in acid, if you dropped it off a building, and the velocity at which it would fall, etc. It won't tell you one little thing about why the pietà is beautiful. It won't tell you one little thing about what makes a city just. It won't tell you one little thing about why a certain act is morally right or wrong. See, so we've got to resist this scientistic attitude that wants to reduce everything to the sciences. That's worked a lot of mischief. Now, if you want to know the fundamental problem with scientism is, it's self-refuting. It shares that dubious distinction with its close cousin, logical positivism. If you remember from your Philosophy 101, there was a very prominent movement in the early 20th century, logical positivism. They were trying to clear up what they took to be ambiguities within the philosophical tradition, and so they said, what makes a statement meaningful is its capacity to be verified or falsified through empirical analysis. So this room in Dallas was filled with 1,000 people. That's a meaningful statement because I could confirm it or deny it through empirical analysis, okay? A statement like, that act is morally wrong, or God exists, or boy, that statue is beautiful. Those aren't so much right or wrong, they're meaningless on the logical positivist reading. Now, how anyone bought that to me is a mystery because, as I say, look at the self-refuting quality of it. What's the one thing you can't empirically verify? The claim that all knowledge is reducible to the empirically verifiable. You can't empirically verify that or falsify it. Same with scientism. What's the one thing that you can't demonstrate through the scientific method? That only things demonstrated through the scientific method are valid. You can't demonstrate that scientifically. So what I want to do in the course of this talk is I'm going to pull on that little loose thread in the hopes of unraveling the whole goofy tapestry of scientism, which has wreaked a lot of havoc among our young people. Okay, so that's the program. If you're keeping score, I'm sorry I don't have any pictures for you today. I apologize. Do you just have my big head up there on the screen? I always at these things feel like the Wizard of Oz, you know. Pay no attention to the little man at the podium. Just look at the big head. So I apologize. Speaking of which, I don't know if Karen is still here, but that image of the little thing walking, I have never in my life seen anything like that. And I agree. I just wanted to watch that over and over again. I just keep showing that. That was the craziest thing. So anyway, I don't have any cool pictures for you, but. Okay, but if you're keeping score now, I'm going to do three things in this talk. I'm going to pull on the thread of scientism in three ways. First of all, by looking at something you heard about from both speakers yesterday, the radical intelligibility of the world. That's the first way of attacking scientism. The second way is by looking at the immateriality of the mind. The immateriality of the mind. Thirdly, at the inescapability of metaphysics. Okay? So those three things I'm going to look at. So first of all, intelligibility. I do think religious people here, we've got to keep insisting upon this because it's such important insight. Can I start with something, again, we probably all read in Philosophy 101, in Plato's greatest dialogue, The Republic, and you find the famous parable of the cave. Do you remember? By the way, that story is repeated over and over again in the culture. Read Fahrenheit 451, or most recently, the Matrix movies. They're all a retelling of the parable of the cave. Namely, I've got to escape from a false or limited consciousness to come to the perception of reality. I have to escape from the cave to see things as they really are. That's Plato. And you remember how it works is he imagines these people who are chained in position, and all they can see are flickering images on the wall of the cave. One person manages to escape from his chains and turns around to see that the images are actually caused by these little puppet figures going by. And then he manages to escape from the cave itself to go up into the light. And at first it's like, here, he's so blinded by the light, he can't see anything. But then he begins to see shadows and images in the upper world. And then when his eyes adjust, he sees the real objects of which those puppets are just images. And then finally, at the very end, he looks up to the sun itself, the source of all light. Okay, that's the parable. What's the point? The point is we tend to begin with this very ordinary form of perception that deals with the passing and evanescent things of this world. The shadows first and images, but then the things in the world that come and go, that are for a time, that move and change, the ordinary experience. Is that real? Yeah, of course it is. Good, it's a form of perception. It's what the sciences deal with. The world of evanescent and passing sense experience, that's what the sciences deal with. For Plato, and here's the point I want you to see. For Plato, the first step out of the cave is into the realm of mathematics. I won't be able to see your hands up, but are there mathematicians here? There have to be, because I know there are scientists here. You can't do science without math, right? Mathematics. When you grasp 2 + 3 = 5, and I don't mean just, oh, there's 2 objects, there's 3 objects, so now there are 5 objects. I mean when you grasp the nettle of that equation, when you see why that must be the case, when you grasp the nature of a number, the number 7, when you grasp the truth of the quadratic formula, you have, in a very real sense, everybody, stepped out of the cave. You've stepped out of the realm of ordinary sense experience. See, because when you grasp 2 + 3 must equal 5, you've seen something that is true in itself, that's true at any time and any place, that's true in any possible world. You've seen something that is true eternally and absolutely. You've stepped out of the cave when you sense mathematical truth. You have grasped, and I'll come back to this later, an intelligible pattern. That moment is of extraordinary significance because it signals a higher form of consciousness. Can I quote here David Tracy? I don't know if you know that name. He's now long retired, but theology professor at the University of Chicago. In a very recent article, he said this: aside from the religions, the major form of invisibility in our time is provided by mathematics and the mathematization of modern science nurtured in the early modern period by Galileo. So aside from religion, let's set that aside for the moment. The major form of invisibility in our time is provided by mathematics. He's making the point I just made, that when you see a pure mathematical pattern, you move from the visible to the invisible. Here's something else off from Tracy. And I remember learning this in sophomore year of high school and finding it fascinating. Is when you have the best compass in the world and you draw what you think, there's the perfect circle. Is that a perfect circle? Well, no, of course not. I mean, if you looked at it with even with a little magnifying glass or much less a microscope, you'd see all kinds of imperfections, wouldn't you, in your attempt to draw a circle. What's the definition of a circle? A locus of coplanar points equidistant from its center. Okay, coplanar, equidistant from its center, makes a circle. I understand the definition. But see, what I just did there, is that a perfect circle? Well, no, that's a vague attempt to gesture in the direction of circularity. You see, Tracy's point is that when you grasp the definition, a coplanar points equidistant from the center, you've moved from this realm of seeing and imagining to a higher realm of understanding and supposing. Here's again a Tracy quote. You can't answer the question, why is a circle round, by looking at a picture of a circle, no matter how beautifully drawn. but I'm quoting again. We can answer the question, but only by moving into a realm of intelligent supposing, a realm that can neither be seen nor imagined, but can be supposed and understood. Mathematics takes us out of the cave into a higher, purely formal and invisible realm. Okay, let's take the next step now. And I'm going to keep quoting Tracy here. Since Galileo, Descartes, Leibniz, and others, so the founders of modern science, science has employed three essential elements. First, dispassionate empirical observations. Okay, science begins by looking out at what's going on, observing the world. Secondly, mathematical conceptual formulations of its hypotheses. And finally, experimental testing of all of its theories. But look at step two, everybody. Look at step two. It's very interesting. The sciences begin, indeed, by looking out, whether it's with these eyes or with telescopes or microscopes or whatever, looking out at what's there. But the second move is the formation of hypotheses disciplined by a mathematical form of reason. You can't do modern science apart from mathematics. Therefore, the very thing that people today think most grounds us in the physical order, in fact, has lifted us to a higher order at the same time. You know what comes to mind here? And I discovered this, I think it might have been Brandon at Word on Fire first got me onto this. A 1960 article written by a physicist named Eugene Wigner. So scientists here, non-scientists too, it's relatively short, readable. 1960, he's a physicist of kind of a younger member of the Einstein, Niels Bohr generation of physicists. Not a believer, by the way, a secular Jew. But he writes this article, and here's the title: The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Physical Sciences. That's a very interesting title. Wait till you get to the article, but the title's interesting. The unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the physical sciences. What did he mean? What does he explore in the article? That if you're going to analyze the physical world, and you're going to make effective predictions and calculations and even create things like bridges and buildings based upon your science, you are going to use necessarily high, complex mathematics. Why should that be the case? Wigner wonders. The unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the physical sciences. The more you go into the sciences, the more you're going to find this abstract, formal, and finally invisible dimension of mathematics. You've stepped in a significant way out of the cave. Okay, one more step here. Plato, go back to the parable of the cave. You escape from the cave, you now come up in the realm of light, and then your eyes adjust and you see the world of forms, of pure intelligibility. And at the limit, you look up to find the sun, which illumines everything, which is the source of intelligibility. Here's the really interesting question, everybody. Where do these mathematically describable, intelligible patterns that the sciences trade in all the time, where do they come from? Why should they be there? In other words, why should the world be in every nook and cranny, whether I'm looking macrocosmically or microscopically, why should the world be marked by this mathematically definable intelligibility? That's a darn good question. Something I find, by the way, in my YouTube sort of work when I'm dealing with a wider public, is the atheists and agnostics, they get really uncurious the minute the questions get really interesting. Do you ever notice that? Like, oh, well, I'm a scientist. I'm a man of reason. I'm going to follow wherever it goes. Yeah, okay. So where do the laws of nature come from? Oh, I don't know. No one knows. No one knows. Why is the world in every nook and cranny intelligible? Oh, no, I don't know. It's a bad question. No, it's not a bad question. It's the question. It's the interesting question. Here's Einstein. I can never follow Einstein all the way when in his science. It's sort of beyond my layman's capacity. But I love it when Einstein kind of moves toward a more philosophical view. Here's one of my favorite lines from the great Einstein. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Bring that line out whenever you're dealing with someone who's in the grip of scientism. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Why should it be marked in every nook and cranny by mathematically describable, intelligible patterns? Now, someone asked the same question, is the late Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. He said, how do you explain the intelligibility of the world? He said, look, finally, if we're honest, the only satisfying explanation is that the universal intelligibility of the created order is the result of a great intelligence which has thought the world into being. I love that line yesterday about the scientists at the end of all their questing come up against a group of theologians, right? Because in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things that came to be through the Word. So of course the world is marked by intelligibility. It's marked by mathematically describable patterning. The sciences intimately depend upon this assumption. And it's finally a theological assumption. Here's just a last line here from the great Ratzinger. He said, look at our language. When we say, I recognize that truth, I recognize that truth, recognize, is I'm cognizing what's already been cognized. I'm knowing derivatively what has already been known into being. I think everybody, the intelligibility of the world is a philosophical path beyond scientism. Okay? Path number 2. The immateriality of the mind. Now, Father Spitzer was gesturing toward this. In fact, I told him at dinner last night, I really regret that he didn't have time to go into all the near-death experience stuff. Read him on that. There's now a huge literature about near-death experience. We know a lot about people's empirical experiences of it. But there's some fascinating stuff about what it says regarding the mind and consciousness, the irreducibility of consciousness to the brain and to the physical, the trans-physical quality of the way that we know. All of that, which our great tradition has been saying for centuries, is being borne out extraordinarily by the near-death experience. Anyway, I'll come back to hear Father Spitzer next year on that. Let me get at it this way now. So I've still got my philosopher's hat on and my Thomas Aquinas hat. Most of modernity is predicated upon a sort of observer-observed understanding of how we know. So here I am, I'm an observer, basically in a passive stance. There's the observed world out there, and that world impresses itself upon me. I take in the information and data from the outside world. Well, that's a very modern way of looking at it, and we take it in with our mother's milk. But it's not the way pre-moderns thought about knowing. It's very illuminating, not the way pre-moderns thought. They thought according to what I call an objective participant model. What do I mean? I mean that the mind goes out to meet the intelligible world in such a way that there's a participation between the two, one in the other, one lighting up and making actual the other. The knowing mind participates in the intelligible structure of the thing known. You know, people, they either make fun of me or they attack me for using Latin when I speak, but I don't care. I like Latin because it's pithy. Thank you, Latin. Here's a great pithy Latin statement from Aquinas. It's making the point I just made. Intellectus in actu est intelligibile in actu. Oh, well, why didn't you say so? See what I mean? Intellectus in actu, that means the mind in act, the mind illumined, right? Actualized. Est intelligibile in actu, is the intelligible thing in act. You see what he's saying? It's the mutuality between knower and known. It's the participation of the knower in the intelligibility of the thing to be known. You say, okay, what difference does that make? Well, when you know a form, an intelligible pattern, a mathematical truth, when you know those things, what's happening? Your mind is now conformed to the thing that you know. Your mind, in a very real sense, becomes the thing that you know. But what's the thing that you're knowing? It's not something material. So, I mean, right now, the data from this room are coming into my senses, right? So that's fine. They're coming into these bodily organs of mine. I can close my eyes. I can now remember and I can imagine what I've just taken in. All of that is perfectly credible in a materialistic context. But when the mind comes to know a pure form, a pure pattern, a mathematical equation, a pure intelligibility. Listen, when it stepped out of the cave into a higher world, it becomes conformed to that world. It is conformed to that world. Intellectus in actu est intelligibile in actu. This is the gravamen of Aquinas' argument for the immateriality of the soul. Again, the mind can know things in a more ordinary way through senses and memory and imagination. And I can understand that in terms of a bodily organ like the brain or the nervous system and the sensorium. Okay. No, but not when the mind is knowing a pure pattern, a pure intelligibility. Now the mind reveals the fact that it is itself immaterial in nature. The mind itself, which comes to know science by means of math, as I just explained, is revealed to be immaterial in its form. That's why all these attempts, read David Bentley Hart on this, he's very good. All the sort of mechanistic, reductionistic attempts to say the mind is nothing but the brain kicking things around and so on. I mean, it just can't make sense of these higher forms of perception. Here's something very interesting to me. This is a David Bentley Hart idea. Learning languages. We've all learned our own languages. Many in this room have learned foreign languages. I'm not great at, I'm not like John Paul II, but I love languages and love learning them. Part of learning a language is learning particular words and sounds and so on, sure. But isn't it also true, a major part of a language is learning syntax and the formal structure of a language. I mean, right now I'm using words and they're coming out my mouth and there's something very physical about all that. But right now, as I'm speaking English to you, I think more or less, right? I'm speaking English to you, I'm grasping right now the formal syntactical structure of the English language. That's not material. That's the perception of a formal pattern. It's one of the reasons why foreign languages are hard to get, because they got different syntactical forms. That's why we struggle with them. I'm trying to speak Spanish or French or German. But in even the most ordinary act of speech, the immateriality of the mind is disclosed. Here's something else now. This is, again, from the great Aquinas. Look at two modern philosophers like David Hume and John Locke. They both said the mind is like an empty theater. The senses bring in data from the outside world, and then they're stored as kind of vague impressions in the empty theater of the mind. That's Hume and that's Locke. That's a kind of purely empiricist account of how we know. Nonsense, says the great tradition. That is a grossly inadequate account of how the mind actually works. Did Aquinas believe that the mind took in data from the outside world? Of course, and that through the senses, and that the mind can retain these things in memory? Of course. But Aquinas speaks of, in his lovely Latin, the intellectus agens. It clumsily rendered in English as the agent intellect. It always sounds like a character in a spy novel or something, agent intellect. Intellectus agens, it's Latin for the acting intellect, the doing, the intellect that's achieving, moving forward, curiously interrogating. That's the intellectus agens. How's it work? Well, Thomas says that the mind takes in the data around it, and then it begins to ask relentlessly, and if you doubt me, hang around kids for a while. It begins relentlessly to ask the question, quid sit? Quid sit, Latin for, what's that? What is that? See, imagine, I think I did see there was like a little baby here. Someone's got a little tiny baby coming in this room. Would look around and would take in the data. But that's all the baby would be capable of, just taking in the sights and sounds and colors. As the mind develops, what happens? The intellectus agens comes into form. It begins to ask, quid sit? What is that? What's going on? What is the pattern that informs the data that I'm experiencing? Now, Thomas Aquinas would have called that intuition into form. The great Bernard Lonergan, like Father Spitzer, a Jesuit, one of the great philosophers of the last century, he called that having an insight. I would say it's discerning the meaningful pattern of something. Now, that could be, what is this? Quid sit? Well, that's a bottle, you know. Oh, what's a bottle? Well, a bottle is a human artifact. And, you know, the mind will keep asking that question. I'll give you another example. So I became a bishop 7 years ago. And my first USCCB meeting, right, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, I show up in Baltimore and I walk into a room, it's not quite as big as this, but big enough, big hotel space. And I'd never been at one of these before. What's going on? Where do I sit? I mean, what do I do at this meeting? And I sat down and took in all the colors and sights and sounds and people buzzing around me. But then the old intellectus agens began saying, quid sit? What is this place? How come that guy speaks all the time? How come we have this agenda? Why didn't we have another agenda? Who's really running the? Oh, there's the three guys up there. But are they really running it? Or quid sit? What's going on? What was I doing? What any act of intelligence is trying to do, to discern the finally invisible, because purely formal, patterns of meaning that make this whole experience intelligible. I'm looking for patterns. I'm looking for forms. Is the mind satisfied? Like when I figured out, oh, that's why that guy talks all the time. Did the mind go to rest? No, I was even more curious. Well, then what's he actually after? And well, okay, that's how the agenda is set by the administrative committee. Who's on the administrative committee? What's the pattern behind that? Now those three guys up there, okay, are they really, well, how come? How come he's, my point is, the mind never rests, does it? It never rests. It keeps seeking higher and higher and more intelligible patterns. What is this? What's going on here? Oh, this is the Wonder Conference. The Wonder. What's the Wonder Conference? Well, it's about faith and science. Faith and science. Well, why are you interested in faith and science? Well, because of evangelization. Well, quid sit? What's evangelization? Oh, well, that's announcing Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, well, who's he? What's that all about? You see what I'm saying? Is the mind, listen, by an inner dynamism. It's not an empty theater in which data dumbly appear. No, the mind is continually searching upward and outward toward intelligible patterns. Lonergan again said the mind finally wants to know everything about everything. Now, that can sound like a little throwaway line. He means that very technically. It wants to understand experience in light of the highest possible form of intelligibility. What do we call that, by the way, Catholics? We call that the beatific vision, right? The vision, the intellectual grasp that finally makes me happy and satisfies me. Now, see, the point I'm making, everybody, is by the inner dynamism of the mind itself at work in any science, we are pushing upward and outward toward the source of all intelligibility. The same thing Plato saw. We're looking up toward the sun, the form of the good. Science doesn't turn us from God. It orders us to God. That's why, maybe you saw, I gave a talk at Google headquarters a couple of years ago, and I called it Religion and the Opening of the Mind. See, because there's such a crazy prejudice out there that religion shuts down the mind. Medieval obscurantism, Bronze Age mythology, afraid to ask the questions. Are you joking? I'm not the one afraid to ask questions. I'll tell you exactly who is. All these materialists out there, all the atheists out there, they're the ones afraid to ask the really interesting questions. By an inner dynamism, the mind pushes toward the fullness of being. Okay, so intelligibility, the immateriality of the mind. Finally, what I'm calling the inescapability of metaphysics. The inescapability of metaphysics. I think, everybody, that the roots of scientism that are dogging us today can be traced all the way back to the late Middle Ages. And a rather fateful move made by people like Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, two philosophers, who opted for a univocal conception of being rather than an analogical conception of being. Oh, that's it. That's where it came. Now, what do I mean? Well, in the Middle Ages, you had three ways of talking. You could talk univocally, equivocally, or analogically. It's really a simple idea. I speak univocally when I say, for example, I'm a human being, you're a human being, we're all human beings. I'm using the term human being univocally. It means the same thing in the different acts of predication. But if I were to say, boy, that dog has got an impressive bark, and boy, look at the bark on that tree. Well, now I'm using the term equivocally, right? I'm using the same term, bark, but I mean something totally different. Then I use the term analogically, which is kind of in between the two. When I say, boy, that body is healthy, and boy, the lunch you just ate, that's really unhealthy. Well, I'm using healthy there in an analogical way. It applies properly to the body, and it's sort of analogically used of a meal that's related to the health of the body. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Univocal, equivocal, analogical. The great Aquinas says, when I talk about God in the world, I'm not using univocal language nor equivocal language. I'm using analogical language. So I say, God exists and I exist. Univocal? No. If it's univocal, then I'm saying, hey, God and I, we're both examples of the genus being. God's a big being and I'm a smaller being. No, says Aquinas. Equivocal, well, no, then I don't mean anything. Then they have nothing in common. Rather, I'm using the term, he said, analogically. Now, why? This is the hinge point. What the word being means, Thomas says, primarily, is in reference to God's manner of being. God is in the full sense. Creatures are, but in a derivative sense, because we participate in the being of God. We reflect to some degree the intensity and perfection of God's way of being. We participate in God. Okay, Occam, Scotus, others abandon that perspective in the late Middle Ages, and they give us a univocal conception of being. No, when I say God is and I am, I mean that in exactly the same sense. See, what's the upshot again? The upshot is God and I are now seen as two types of being. God's a big, infinite being, and I'm a smaller, finite being. But we're both beings. I say, what's that do, everybody? What's that do? It sets God and the world in tension with each other, in competition with each other. For God to take up space, I got to get out of the way, right? For God to assert his prerogatives, I've got to withdraw my prerogatives. Now, this view, by the way, and this is a really interesting story, but I can't go into it, but it was bequeathed to the Protestant reformers. Now, read almost any page of Luther and Calvin, what do you find? Is this competitive view of God and the world. Oh, God gets all the glory. Okay, good. That means I get no glory. I'm nothing. St. Irenaeus said, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. That's a different story, isn't it? That means if God gets the glory, then I'm more alive, not less. God and the world are not in competition with each other. God and the world are not beings existing side by side and then struggling for primacy. I think everybody, you look at the history of science and the so-called struggle between religion and science, it often hinges on this problem. Is I got this big being out there, and how does that fit into the system? I got this big being, God. How does he fit into the mechanistic system that I put together? You know the famous story about Laplace, the Enlightenment era cosmologist, and he came to see Napoleon and he displayed to him his model of the cosmos. And Napoleon supposedly said to him, where does God fit into that? And with the kind of hauteur that only the French can muster, he said, Je n'ai pas besoin de cette hypothèse. I have no need of that hypothesis. I mean, look, I got my system here. I don't need this competing mechanistic cause that you're calling God. All that story shows everybody is that both Napoleon and Laplace misunderstood God. They didn't know what our great tradition means by God. God is not one cause among many, not a competing cause, not one being in the world. This comes up, by the way, all the time in my YouTube type ministry. People display what I've come to call the Yeti theory of God. Yeti, Bigfoot. Some say there is a Bigfoot. Others say there isn't. Let's go look, and what's the evidence? So where's God? Or you remember, some old enough to remember the Sputnik, the Russian cosmonaut goes up, and I was up in the heavens, I looked around, there was no God. Well, I mean, that's the colossally stupid view that comes from this hyper-modern understanding of the God-world relationship, which in turn comes from the univocal conception of being. So I blame Duns Scotus for that comment of the Russian cosmonaut. But you see, the point I'm making is that's not what God is. God's not a thing in the world that I'm going to look around to find. God is rather the reason why there is a world at all. God is the sun by which I see all things. God is the reason why there's something rather than nothing. But let's not play the game of this competitive supreme being that has to make room for the sciences to flourish. None of that is true. The more we affirm the world, the more we can affirm God, and vice versa. Okay, I'm going to just cut to the chase a little bit here. What's a way forward here now? And this is where I'm speaking of the inescapability of metaphysics. A term that I've been using and was used by the previous two speakers a lot, and one that we kind of just take for granted, but is a really interesting term, is the term universe. A universe. Why do we refer to all things as a universe? Why not just say it's this kind of aggregate of disparate things? It's just a kind of vague collectivity of disparate things. Why do we call it a universe? Because look what that word means. Universum. That means turned toward the one. It's intriguing, isn't it, that word? We throw it around, the universe. But versum, turned toward the one. What's the one toward which everything is turned? Well, I'll give you the answer of classical metaphysics. Being. Now see, the scientific mind doesn't really want to go there, because that's a metaphysical question. What do all things have in common? God, they're as diverse as can be. Think of all the things and objects and events in the physical universe, as different as they could be. What's the one thing they all necessarily have in common? Is that they are. They are, from a black hole to a snail to that little thing we saw walking along yesterday. It still haunts me. But it is that thing, whatever that is, that little walker is. The great Jacques Maritain, the marvelous French metaphysician, deeply Catholic thinker of 20th century, who went through a very similar thing, beginning as a mathematician and scientist, and then reaching a point of real despair. He and his future wife sat in the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris, and they said, unless we can figure out the meaning of life by this time next year, we will commit suicide. The very French sort of move, too, you know. But Maritain, as he came to a metaphysical awakening, used this lovely term. He said he was out one day, you know, in nature, looking at the sky and the trees, and he said, suddenly the trees whispered being. It's very interesting moment. The trees whispered being. There's a tree, and I can analyze it biologically and chemically, and you know, I can look at all the different aspects of it. I can measure it. I can, you know, all that. I can scientifically analyze it. But that fine day, the trees whispered being. In other words, they spoke of that fundamental reality that all things have in common. They all are. Here's something interesting. We talked about multiple universes, and I think I know roughly what the scientists mean by that. There are different, you know, causal systems within these things, or different temporal arrangements. And so I speak, I would say from a philosophical standpoint, very casually about multiple universes. But see, from a philosophical standpoint, that's really a lot of nonsense to say multiple universes. Universum, turn toward the one. Whatever those other things are, what? They exist, right? They exist. Therefore, all of them, let's say there are a million, you know, alternate universes, they all turn toward the one. The trees whispered being. The planets whisper being. That little walker whispered being. Okay, one more step. I got 10 minutes, and one more step. What's the nature of this being toward which all things in our experience turn? Our great tradition says it's contingent. Contingent. That means it is, but doesn't have to be. Think, everybody, of anything. Think of this room right now. Here we all are, the Wonder Conference in Dallas, Texas, 1,000 people in this room. Does it exist? Yep. Is it whispering being? Yeah. Is it turned toward the one? Yes. Does it have to be? No. And I'll tell you, this is the truth. I was stuck in Tampa, Florida. I was coming here from Tampa. I was on a retreat, and the plane was delayed. Hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. And then I heard that the flights the next morning to Dallas were booked up. And for a hot minute, I thought, I'm not going to make it to this thing. I might have missed this conference. You might have all missed this conference. You might have all gotten sick or been called away or whatever. This building could have collapsed 5 days ago. The simple point I'm making is, here we are, but we don't have to be here. We must be here because of a cause. A whole nexus of causes must have brought this state of affairs into existence. It's not here on its own. That little walker we saw yesterday, what brought that thing into? You think I'm obsessed with that little? What does it have to be that way? Absolutely not. So I search for causes. What if I find some other contingent cause that produced it? Well, then I have to ask where that came from. And then I find some other contingent cause. Well, where did that come from? What can I do? I can never say, oh, I've found the ultimate cause of all things in the material universe. Well, no, because the material universe doesn't have to be. Our great intellectual tradition says that the contingent being of the universe, toward which all things are turned, points finally toward a non-contingent source of its being. When Moses asked God, what's your name? When the people asked me, what should I call you? What did God whisper? Being. I am who I am. To be God is to be to be. God is the reason why there's a contingent being, that toward which all things turn, at all. The deeper you go into the analysis of the physical contingent world, the more you will turn toward God. Okay, one last little word by way of conclusion. I hope everybody, I'd be happy if from this talk, which I know has been kind of on the highly philosophical side, but if you take away one thing, when we Catholics are engaging the wider culture, we are not rowing around in some little leaky rowboat of an intellectual tradition. We are on this great ocean liner of an intellectual tradition. I know we dumbed down the faith, which meant, you know what that meant? We all got off of that boat and we got onto a little leaky rowboat. And then we're surprised that people say, oh, these poor religious people, these poor dumb religious people. Well, again, partially we did it to ourselves. No, we come out of an intellectual tradition that we have claimed going all the way back to the great Greek philosophers, coming up through the medieval doctors and into the modern period, and great figures like John Henry Newman and G.K. Chesterton and John Paul II and Jacques Maritain, etc. And that when we engage this wider world, we should do it with panache. We should do it with confidence. That we should not be cowed by the voices of a materialism that is simply a reductive and finally illogical move. No, we should go out not belligerently, but with a kind of blithe confidence on this great ocean liner of our intellectual tradition. And I say this finally to all the teachers and preachers here. Teach our tradition. Teach our tradition. Communicate our tradition. We've been bullied for too long. That's my point. We've been bullied for too long by the advocates of a finely reductive and irrational worldview. We've got the far more intellectually compelling worldview, and we should claim it with confidence and enthusiasm. All right, God bless everybody. Thank you.